is the concept of making sure that we understand that the life that we seek, which is a life of connection to God, depends on a connection to God. Now, I know that sounds circular, but we have to recognize that the things that we're looking for, let's say today we hear a lot of talk about freedom, we hear a lot of talk about liberty, we hear a lot of talk about being free of tyranny and so forth. But those things are only accomplished, they're only possible if a person is connected to God. So if a person is saying to themselves, they want to be free, they want to have liberty, they want to be free of tyranny, but that's it. Kind of like an anti-position, a position of irritation and resistance, then the end result is that it's not connected to God Almighty. It's connected to their own, wanting to be free of restraints. And the restraints that they don't like is the governor or the government says this and that or the other thing, but they're not connecting to something that is a source of positive direction. And what we need to realize is that the examples of the greatest prosperity in humanity have occurred in the times when people have been connected to God Almighty. And we look and see that in the Tanakh and in the Bible itself. We see that when the Jewish people were connected to God, then there was peace and prosperity. That was something that was evident now in an incredible way, that everything was peaceful, everything was prosperous, and the Jewish people were having a positive influence on the nations around them. When, on the contrary, God forbid, the Jewish people went and said and got disconnected from God, then what happens is they start to receive the influence of the wayward behaviors of the nations around them, and then it leads to destruction and to tyranny, slavery, and people coming in from outside or even from inside if you have a king who went bad. So it's interesting in terms of the prosperity also that if you look in the book of Judges, you'll see that the enemies of the Jewish people would come in and they would make it impossible. They would destroy the crops. They would actually, it wasn't just enough for them to terrorize the Jewish people or to keep them under their rulership, but it was there was a concerted effort to destroy the food supply. So the Jewish people would not only be physically afraid of their lives, but also be short of food and be subjugated that way. So this is what we see in this week's Torah portion, that God says, if you will walk in my paths, and this is specifically, the commentator Rashi specifically says this is referring to learning Torah, which we're doing now, then, and you guard my mitzvahs, and you fulfill my commandments, and you do them, then I will nasati gishmechem b'itam, I will give you the rains in their time, meaning to say, it's not just enough to have rain, but anyone who spends any time in a farming type situation or a gardening type situation, or even a growing fruit trees and so forth, you start to realize that the quantity and the nature of the rain is actually very significant. If you're just living in a city and you look out the window, you don't really pay attention to what kind of rain it is. Is it a light rain? It is with a heavy wind or not? You might look outside and say, this is beautiful, this is nice, whatever it is, I better take an umbrella. But you're not really recognizing the significance of these differences. Hail or heavy rains. But if you now are dealing with growing fruit, and food, which is necessary for human existence, you start to realize that every detail of the rain is something that is absolutely an important detail. Not only the quantity of the rain, the speed of the rain, the heaviness of the drops, and the time when it falls. And these are the things that are absolutely critical. So God is saying, I'm going to give you blessing in all that it's going to be coming down at the right times, in the right quantity, and when you need it. If you have rain at harvest time, it's a huge disaster. You need to be dry at harvest time. You need to be wet at the beginning of some wetness at the beginning of the season, so that it could have the ground could be able to grow the crops. And you can't have rain when you're harvesting; it'll destroy it and it'll become moldy. So God gives us a blessing. He says, in that land will give its bountiful crops, and the tree of the field, is going to give, excuse me, give its fruit. V'hisig lachem dayish es b'tzir yasig es zera v'chaltem lachem l'seva v'yishavtem levetem b'artzachem. And you are going to have all the everything that you need. That you're going to have. You're going to be so occupied in your the crops are going to be so abundant. You're going to each season, a farmer has different seasons. So he has the season when he's going to plow the ground, and then he's going to plant the crops, and then he's going to have to harvest the crops. He's got to thresh it, and he's got all these things. They're just going to run one into the next because of the abundance. You're going to be so busy processing the crops that you harvest. You're going to run into the next planting season. That's the blessing. That's the abundance, blessing of abundance. So you're going to have l'seva. You're going to have such. You're going to be sustained. You're going to feel full inside. And then God says, "I'm going to give you peace in your land." So first it says, "I'm going to." Just one second. So he says over here, "V'shavtem leveta ba'artzachem," you're going to sit in peace in your land. V'nesati sholem ba'aretz u'shchavtem ve'ein machrid, and you're going to live in peace in your land, and you are going to be serene, and you're nothing to be afraid of, and all the wild animals, and there's going to be no swords crossing through your land. And u'daftem esayvechem v'naflu v'nechem v'chorav, and to the extent they have any enemies, they're just going to flee in front of you, and they're going to fall in front of you. And then he says, "Radfu mikem chamisha mea umea mikem ravavo yirdoifu v'naflu yivechem lifanechem l'chorav." And your enemies are just going to flee in front of you. 5 of you are going to be able to chase away 100 people, and 100 are going to be able to chase away throngs of people, and you're just going to be able to just be confident, and instead of being in a place of contraction, you'll be in a place of expansion. So, and then God says, "I'm going to turn towards you, and I'm going to expand you, and I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to establish my covenant with you." And then it continues with more and more blessings. This is the consequences of being in this state of connection with God Almighty. And it requires two things. It requires learning, and it requires action. For a person to be able to have these blessings, to make a vessel for these blessings, and to be able to draw down these blessings, a person has to be learning, which is expanding his mind and his heart to be able to connect and see God in everything that is around him and all of existence. And he also needs to be able to carry through on the actions and refrain, or carry through on the positive actions that are necessary to be kind, to give, to do acts of a connection to God, and also to refrain from the negative actions that are things that are taking him away from his real purpose in life. So that would be not worshiping idols, and not eating forbidden foods, and not being in forbidden relations, and so forth. These are all things that are now putting a person directly in line when he's fulfilling these mitzvahs. Now he's put directly in line for God's blessing. So how does this obviously applies to us, and it applies to us both in an individual way, and applies to us in a national way, in the sense of seeing the course of history, seeing how the world is flowing and time and history is flowing, that as the disconnect with God Almighty becomes greater, God forbid, like we see that they took, in the United States of America, they took the knowledge of God out of the public schools, and it happens in every country. In Israel also, the schools are completely secular, completely, other than the religious schools, but the average Israeli is going to a completely secular school run by Marxist teachers. God should save us from this terrible situation, but that's the same thing we have in the United States of America, just a disconnect from God, and instead is taught, people are taught to steal. Marxism is the concept of stealing one from the other. So not only is a person not taught that there's a God, and not only are they not told they're not supposed to steal, but what Marxism does, and I'm using Marxism as a term to refer to all forms of the cult of scarcity, it comes along and tells a person, because there's not enough to go around, therefore it is not a sin to steal. It's actually a mitzvah to steal. It becomes what communism does and Marxism does is it steals the ideas of the Torah and God's ideas of the words and the concepts, and then inverts them. So whereas in the Torah, if you're forbidden to steal, Marxism comes and says, no, actually, Marxism comes and commands you to steal. It says, no, the right thing to do is to steal and give it to whoever you see fit. As opposed to saying, no, only God decides who gets what, and then I respect that, and I do my job to provide what I need, and I don't have to steal from anybody else. So what happens is when you take a God out of the system, when you take God out of the learning system, and you take God out of a person's, and why can't you have a system? Let me finish that sentence. When you take God out of the system, then it leads to a complete deterioration in the civilization, a collapse of the civilization. So, but here's the other thing. You might say to yourself, one second, why can't we take these bright ideas? They obviously work, and just do them, because life is better that way. Because if you're doing it based on human logic, if you're doing it based on an understanding that it's somehow better, then because you're going to get benefit from it, and that's your motivation, then what happens is it is something that your mind is going to say, you know, today I'm not really feeling so in tune with this. I really feel like, you know what, it's true, I don't think I should steal, but right now I really need something. And then you justify yourself based on the logic that it's somehow okay. And once you make it based on human logic, then human logic could take you anywhere. And that's what happens. That's what the Nazis are about. It's about the German education system taking God out of the system, and then logic could justify anything. And then the German people it could be justified to the German people by the people from the cult of scarcity that wanted to destroy humanity, that they could use the little disconnect from God Almighty to now convince the rest of the German people to cooperate or stay silent. And so we have to look and realize that it's not possible when we're working to bring around a change in the situation in the world. We could say to ourselves, okay, listen, here I am, I want what? When we take this, we look around and say, listen, I would like to have liberty. And there's a guy who doesn't believe in God, and he wants liberty also. So on one hand, we definitely have common objectives. We have a common understanding because we recognize the dangers of the fact that it's not right that there should be tyranny. And we also have what's in common. We're both human beings, and we're both created in God's image. So we have a lot in common. But if that person thinks that it comes from logic and through his own force and his own strength, he's going to somehow be able to end tyranny, and then somehow this new state of freedom is going to survive and last and thrive, I want to suggest that what the Torah is telling us is not possible. Because the real drive for liberty is a godly experience. The real drive for human liberty and human expansion in a way of goodness, in a way of prosperity, of true abundance, is actually something that comes as a God-driven experience. And that really, if we look back to American history, we would see that what drove the concept of individual liberty, that rights come from God Almighty, not just individual liberty. It's that the rights of a human being, each one of us has, is from God Almighty directly, individually, and constantly be given to us and can't be taken away from us. That is a God-driven experience. That's a God-driven recognition. That is unchangeable as long as a person continually is learning Torah, the source of these concepts, the source of this drive, and is constantly fulfilling the commandments and making sure that his actions are in line with becoming closer with God and becoming closer with his fellow human, and he's staying away from things that are going to create disruption and destruction, then that's something that endures. Once that connection becomes weakened, then we see what's happening in America. It becomes chaos. It becomes more and more communism, becomes more and more Marxism. We're in the middle of a communist Marxist revolution right now because people don't even know the difference between right and wrong. People are now saying that the biggest wrong you could do is what you say with your words, while people are stealing things. And that's not considered wrong. That's considered a good thing. So 1 second, everything's completely reversed here over here. People don't even talk about property rights anymore. People talk about privacy rights. That's also a loss of connection to the God's concept of He is the master of the world. He created the world and He distributes for temporary management various property and various objects into human management temporarily. That's something that is a godly concept. They don't talk about that anymore because there's a move away from property rights because that's something that's a God-given concept, the idea of property rights. So what we need to recognize is that in order to create an enduring liberty, it has to be a God-driven experience, and it has to be a God-driven experience. It has to be connected to the divine truth. It has to be something that's connected and rooted in. So, for example, if someone was going to say that they want to create a community of people, and it's going to be a secular thing, and people can believe whatever they want, right? Well, that community is going to devolve into chaos in a very short period of time, because even though everyone wants freedom, everyone's going to have different calculations. No one has a standard. No one has a divine, unchangeable standard on how to conduct themselves and how to conduct the community. On the other hand, if you have a Torah-based community, then you have clear guidelines as to how it's supposed to conduct itself and how each individual is supposed to conduct themselves. Yes, there's liberty, but we have guidelines as to that liberty is driven by God-driven liberty and not just a resistance to being told what to do liberty. So this is what the Torah is coming to teach us. And our job is to make sure that we're constantly, at every moment, reconnecting ourselves with a recognition that God Almighty is running the world. And that's why one of the things I like to share with people is people get very, very focused on the negative that's going on in the world, but we still have to, as they say, wake up and smell the flowers, or wake up, they say, wake up and smell the coffee, but pause and smell the flowers maybe. But, you go outside, you have to look at the sunset, you have to look at the sunrise, you look at the leaves growing, spring, summer, the animals, the birds. Listen to all this. This is God speaking to us, and God's creation. He's creating it for our benefit. We need to be full of joy and gratitude all the time. And yes, we do need to focus on recognizing that there's people who want to undermine that and destabilize us through their psyops and their distractions that they have coming at us from 360 degrees, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, trying to get us off track and trying to get society and the people around us off track. But really, our experience is meant to be right now. It's not that a joyous life connected to God is something that we will have when we finally, all the evil people are defeated. It will be complete when all the evil is defeated and eradicated. But right now, we have to be in a state of feeling God's presence and God's love for us and God's care and for all of creation at every instant. See that. Like we're learning Shar Yichud, we're learning to see that there's nothing separate from God Almighty. Everything is completely unified. Everything is one. And our job is to see that in the general sense and in the detailed sense. So that's how we're looking at the entire world. That's the reality that we see when we look at the entire world. And so I see there's a question over here. Well, okay, the question is, can a person forfeit these rights? Is that possible? Or would we say that we cannot possibly separate ourselves from our rights? Well, a person cannot separate themselves from what God is giving them. That is a person's entire existence is from God Almighty. There's nothing that exists without God giving it existence at that moment. And that existence is reinvigorated, it's initiated every instant, every second. So that is all coming from God Almighty. You cannot stop something from existing. You cannot take, like, even if you take, for example, a piece of wood and you try to destroy it, you're not actually destroying it. You're just changing its presentation. You're chopping it up or you're burning it or whatever it is, but it's still the energy, the divine energy that created it doesn't cease to exist. So it's not possible. So God gave us, for example, God created us in the divine image. We can't not be created in the divine image. That's how God created us. We can, God forbid, choose to conduct ourselves inappropriately. That's not fitting for a person created in the divine image, but doesn't change the fact that we are created in the divine image at every moment, including the moment when we're not acting appropriately. So the concept, for example, a person has a right to defend himself. A person could choose not to exercise that right, but no one can take that right away from the person. Even if they change all the laws and says no one may defend themselves, which was what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah, that everything was twisted around so that the people who were, if a person was attacked, then the person who was arrested was the victim. A whole very, very crooked inversion of reality was what Sodom and Gomorrah was about. And so we have to recognize that human beings can conduct themselves that way, but it doesn't change their fundamental rights. For example, we have a right to speak. We have a right to breathe. That's just how God creates us. Now, could another human being come along and say, you can't speak, and a person could choose to then close their mouth and not say anything? That's not taking away their right. That's just restricting their ability to exercise that right at that moment in time. But the right itself is not taken away. And if you want to talk in terminology, the real difference is in terms of understanding between individual liberties and civil liberties. One of the really undermining ways in which terminology is used is that over the last 20, 30, 40 years, they started talking about civil rights and civil liberties. Well, we don't believe, the concept here is not about civil liberties. The concept is really about individual liberties. What's the difference? The difference is like this. An individual liberty comes from me existing. God is giving me that right. Now, that's inalienable. I can't give that away, and you can't take it away from me. You can make as many board meetings as you want, as many parliament meetings as you want. Courts could rule, the king could do whatever he wants, but it's not going to change that those rights can't be taken away from me. Civil rights, if you look up the origin of the word civil, it means from civic, from the concept of a city, that your rights are coming from the fact that you are a citizen in that city. So the rights that you have are really temporal. They only exist so long as that you are a citizen of that city. And they only exist so long as the city is giving you those rights. So the city, the other citizens can get together and decide, or the king or whoever it is takes control of this city, can then decide who has what rights and can apply them unevenly, could have different classes of people, all kinds of different rights and obligations for people, but it's coming from the city. Now, the incredible thing about having individual rights is the individual rights that we have don't come from the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is just people were in an inspired moment of connection to godliness over the 150 years leading to the creation of this country, and they recorded that in a piece of paper. But our rights don't come from the Declaration of Independence. They don't come from the Constitution. They don't come from the Bill of Rights. They don't come from the court's interpretations of it. They're all completely not the source. The source is from God Almighty. That's what the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and the God-fearing people who created this country recognized. Now, what that means is that you could go fly into any country you want in the world. You still have all the same rights, even if they're, and the people in those countries have the same rights. Even if they don't have a constitution, a Bill of Rights, and so forth, those rights exist for them too. Whether or not they know about it, and whether or not they're conscious of it, whether or not they're living that way and acting that way, and whether or not the people that they defer to allow to run their lives acknowledge that, is a separate question. but the actual right itself cannot be taken away from any person. If people end up going to make a colony on Mars, all the rights are going to apply there, no matter what. Will they make in their station, colony? Will they say people cannot speak, people cannot assemble, and then some people will volunteer to go live in that place, and then they're going to decide that they want to live that way. They're not surrendering their rights. They're just choosing not to exercise their rights, and that's tragic to see people do that. But that's why God gave us free will. God gave us the free will to be able to choose whether to speak, whether we want to meet with people, whether we want to pray, whether we want to learn Torah, whether we want to defend ourselves, and whether we want to have private property. Those are all choices. But those are rights that we have, and we always have that free choice. And that's what makes life so interesting. And part of God's vision for us is that we are experiencing his realization of his dream of people that will make individually and then collectively the right choices, and make those choices in a way that it becomes permanent reality for all of humanity. That's what the redemption is. So with that, we're going to pause for this week, and everyone should have a good Shabbos, and we'll continue next Thursday night, 8 p.m. Eastern, with Shar Yuchud. We'll be starting chapter 5 next week. And thank you all very much for participating. God bless you all.